Good evening, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives. Good to be back on the air. It's been a few days. Been a little under the weather, so I've missed you guys. Hopefully you've missed me a little bit anyway. In any event, I wanted to, before I bring my guest on, I wanted to just kind of say, our movement has been splintering all over the place because most of us really don't have a clue about economics. It's just a sad truth. Our media lies to us. Our professors in school teach us, old world mysticism. The newspapers are completely and utterly devoid of factual information. And you all have decided to fill in the gaps with myths and legends around the water cooler. So we're in this awkward position now where we've got to try to make up time and fill in the gaps because, quite frankly, people are dying. So with that, because of popular demand, Rohan Grey has agreed to come back with us, and hopefully he'll come back many more times, but let me bring Rohan on. Rohan, welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So you were on a roll last time, right before technical glitches got us. It seems to be the flavor of the day with these silly live streams is these technical glitches. But why don't you go ahead and give us a recap, get us back on target, and then afterwards we'll break into neoliberalism.
Yeah, we're all racing the clock a bit. So we were at the end. We were talking about ways to organize and sort of different strategies at different levels, and I'll come back to that. But I wanted to touch on a question that I sort of only half answered before, and that question was about inflation. And so just to briefly recap what I said, although hopefully the two parts can be viewed together in the future. I pointed out that hyperinflation is a qualitatively different phenomenon than regular inflation. And I pointed out that the difference between going from $5 to $6 to $7 to $8 every year, or on whatever fixed period that they change prices, is different from a spiraling price level where the value of the currency collapses. I also mentioned that there hasn't been a hyperinflation with a floating non-convertible currency in a democracy. And I said that was relevant and I didn't get back to it. So I wanted to just clarify that the reason it's relevant is because hyperinflations are historically the result of political or economic breakdowns. So to give an example, Weimar Germany had a massive loss of productive capacity when they gave up their industrial land in the Ruhr region to France after losing the war. They also had massive debts denominated in French francs that they had to get those francs on the currency exchange markets. At the same time, there were large labor strikes in other parts of Germany. So you had this situation where the country was trying to sell as many Deutschmarks to buy French francs at the same time as their productive capacity was collapsing. In response, of course, printing did cause hyperinflation, but it wasn't the money printing that started the whole thing off. It wasn't that they aimed for 5% spending one year and accidentally hit 6%. It was a set of conditions that they were under that was made them unsustainable. Similarly with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe involved a huge transfer of ownership of farms from the white farm owners to native Zimbabweans. But when that happened, they didn't have much experience running these large collective farms, and productive capacity dropped by about 90%. So at the same time, you had a new regime under Mugabe come into power that wasn't collecting taxes and was spending a lot of money just to give to cronies, not to build infrastructure or encourage investment or anything. So you had this huge drop in productive capacity and a breakdown in the sort of regular functioning of the currency. So both of those examples that people normally think about hyperinflation are examples where the political and economic system breaks down and then the currency follows after it. It's not that the currency gets overspent and then everything goes to hell. I was also talking about inflation, and I mentioned that typically there are a lot of different prices that can be changed in the economy, and how you measure them is a political decision. Not only that, the ways that those prices get changed and the reasons they get changed varies. And the stories and the reasons for why that happened have a lot more to do with companies targeting profit margins and market concentration and power and price setting and price fixing than they do with these sort of mechanical perfect competition mechanisms or mechanical mechanisms to do with the supply of money, where if the supply of money goes up, there's automatically a certain amount of inflation. The other thing I said, and this to get back to the heart of what I wanted to get to today, is that the whole definition of what is the money supply is a contested idea. So for the standard sort of hyperventilation story to be true, it has to be a very big deal to spend more money by the government. If there were other sources of money, new money creation, then government spending would be only one of a number of things we should be concerned about. Now, with inflation, there could be reasons, like I mentioned last time, like with an oil, where countries jack up the prices that they sell oil, and in doing so, sort of create a bottleneck in a very important industry that can cause inflation. You could also have inflation if purchasing power went up, but productive capacity was at full capacity, which doesn't really happen very often. But if you have a situation where you have inflation going on as a result of too much spending by the government, the question to obviously ask, and this is also something I brought up when we were talking about the central banking story with regards to Truman, is what are the other sources of purchasing power also going on at the same time? Whether that's bank lending, or whether that's shadow banking activity, or whether that is, to get very basic, you lending your friend money and then giving you an IOU.
What is shadow?
All of those conditions can create purchasing power that didn't otherwise exist, and in doing so can create pressure on prices and goods in the same way as government spending can. So it's very important when we talk about inflation that, yes, there can be situations where too much spending or too much consumer purchasing power in the economy can cause inflation. But those situations can also be caused by a whole range of factors that have nothing to do with government spending. Anyway, that was just my little sort of second part of that answer. Thanks for letting me finish it up.
Can you hear me okay, Rohan?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So let me ask you a question. When you raised the issue of, God, I'm sorry, I'm going back a few seconds ago. You had used the term, and I tried to say it, and I don't think you heard me, and I've lost it just as quickly as I said it. There was a, and we'll just go on, move on. I can't remember it right now. I'm so sorry. I don't normally do that, but I completely lost my train of thought there. I was trying to find a word that you had said a minute ago and ask you for an explanation of it. Sorry. So moving on, where are we headed now, Rohan? I'm sorry about that.
No worries. If you do remember, let me know.
Will do. Shadow banking.
Well,
thank you, Aaron. Thank you. Can you describe shadow banking to us? Thank you.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Yeah, because I talked about banking last time. So we talked about central banks and the Treasury, and we talked about regular banks. Now, one of the reasons that regular banks are so important is because most of us use the banking system for most of our payments on a day-to-day basis. So when you log into your Chase account or your community bank account, you have a number that comes up. Hopefully it's positive, or if it's your credit card number, hopefully it's low. And that number is a liability that the bank owes you. That isn't cash sitting in a vault that belongs to you. That is a liability of the bank to you. And think about this like a bookie. If you and a friend decide to do a trade between each other, but you both have relationships with a bookie, you can just ask the bookie to trade accounts between the two of you. You don't need to actually have any money. You can just move IOUs between the two of you on the bookie's balance sheet. The same thing happens with banks. When you pay someone else, the numbers change on the bank's scorecard, but they're not changing underlying cash or anything like that. So the thing that because most of us are fine on a day-to-day basis using bank deposits as our day-to-day money, including even as our savings, the banks end up capturing a lot of network effects of the payment system. But, and this is the crucial thing, around the world, most banking systems only have deposit insurance. That is to say, they pay into an insurance system that is ultimately backed by the government. In the event that a bank fails, their depositors, the customers, us, get made whole on our accounts, but only up to $150,000 in the US and a similar amount in other countries. So if you have millions and millions and millions of dollars, or if you are a money manager for a pension fund or something like that, you can't keep your cash float in a regular bank account because you might be sloshing around hundreds of billions of dollars in a day, and you might need to keep a few percent of that in cash just for your sort of day-to-day needs. But you can't keep a few $billion in a regular bank account and get insurance on that. So if you do that, you're taking out massive risk in the event the bank fails. So what shadow banking is it's a way for these large institutional investors, think money managers who play around with 9-figure numbers on their bank accounts on behalf of either hedge funds or pension funds or just very large rich investors. These people needed a place to park their cash. And so the place they started parking them was in these entities that acted like banks, but they didn't issue deposits. They issued things like money market fund shares that were backed by government treasury securities. So the reason that banks are so special, apart from the fact that we all use them for payments, is they have access to the central bank. So they can always get liquidity from the central bank if they need it. They can always get cash to meet their overnight cash needs. Most of us don't get access to the central bank. It's a special club that only banks have access to. So the shadow banking system is a way to sort of backdoor entry to the central bank by using treasury securities as the underlying coin of the realm. So one thing you'll hear MMTers say is that government debt is often more money than cash. And that's because while we're all down on the ground like ants, moving around, $10 here, $1,000 there, these guys who are playing with hundreds of billions of dollars up in the air aren't using cash. They're not using quarters. They're not using nickels and dimes. They're using electronic accounts full of these treasury securities or liabilities of these shadow banking institutions that issue things that look like bank accounts but are backed by treasury securities. And these shadow banking institutions, it's important to note, are ultimately backed up by the banking system. So in 2008, when these shadow banks started to go under, they all kind of shriveled up the next layer of the pyramid into the banking system. In the same way as when there's a bank run, the banks shrivel sort of up into the central bank. So the shadow banking system is separate to the regular banking system in the sense that it does different things and has different access to the central bank, but it's connected by the same companies. It's ultimately the sort of same mega company that runs it and a lot of banks. For example, Goldman Sachs has parts of it that you would call shadow banks, but also a regular commercial bank. So they are connected. Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, I see a question from one of the people in the audience. Curious about increased use of U.S. military to bully nations to trade in U.S. dollars and to support bond values. Is that what we're talking about here, or is that conspiracy?
So there's a couple of things. One is, I think it is hard to deny that the fact that the United States has hundreds of military bases around the world and is an active partner in a large number of military, agreements with other countries affects its perceived stability in the international financial system. It's also not a coincidence that the major international financial institutions, that is to say the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank of International Settlements, all had origins in the post-World War II order. So it was the sort of new world setup that came post-World War II, where a lot of the Bretton Woods regime that then sort of started to collapse in 1971, but still has its sort of legacy today, emerged. That said, the other thing to say there is, it is true that most oil contracts in the world are denominated in US dollars. So that is something that doesn't have to be the case, but is the case, and there are probably reasons why. But I don't know enough about the sort of particular foreign policy around certain trade deals where this might have come up. But the United States' reserve dollar status is certainly connected, I think, to its military power. I don't think it has to be as crude as them sort of brandishing a sword and saying we're going to war. That said, there is a case, for example, in the late 1970s where the US used foreign exchange sanctions on Iran and sort of cut off their access to a lot of banking deposits. And you can also look at, for example, the court case in New York against the country of Argentina for their debt, and they were not wanting to pay it, and the whole thing ended up becoming an issue about whether or not the debt was issued by a sort of legitimate government or not. There's a legal doctrine called the odious debt doctrine, where if you have debt that was issued by a corrupt regime, that debt isn't payable. But Argentina was ordered to pay its debt to these creditors who took it to court in New York. And that has sort of pretty far-reaching implications to the way that national sovereignty is perceived relative to, international financial treaties and contracts.
Okay. So, when listening to Mosler's explanations of the quote-unquote petrodollar, he says, it could be the banana dollar. It could be, he basically says it's just a means of exchange. Our dollar's not the dollar or whatever. It would go through a typical foreign exchange as well. Is it really a big deal to be the quote-unquote reserve? Because there's many reserve currencies in the world today, correct?
So the US is really the only one. I mean, China has a pretty strong position, but the US is really the only reserve currency. I talked about the petrodollar last time. I mean, on one level, any commodity or good that is necessary for social survival can at some level, be considered to have an exchange rate with the currency. So I joked, if you ran out of oxygen, the currency would have no value. So there's a currency standard. There's an oxygen standard at one level. So when it comes to oil, we use oil for a lot of different functions right now. So if there is a problem with supply, that can be significant to a lot of different markets in terms of their costs, say their imports or their costs of, one stage in the manufacturing process or something. So when you have a good like that, what you try to do is make sure that you don't become so dependent on a single source, and over time try and reduce your dependence in general. So the US has a lot of oil reserves that it's tapping right now, which, I don't like from an environmental standpoint, but I can understand from a sort of national security standpoint. And there hasn't been, since the 70s, I don't believe, a sort of significant throttling of oil prices by OPEC, because there are a range of different sources that it can be obtained from today. I'd also say, obviously, the more you move into things like renewables, the less this becomes an issue, although I know that oil has a lot of different uses apart from merely as fuel, in things like plastics. So I don't think that it's so much, worrying about a petrodollar alone as it is just trying to reduce reliance on any single commodity that could be a bottleneck and any particular supplier that could be a bottleneck. And to go to your question about what the benefits are of a reserve currency, on one level, a lot of other entities use your currency as a sort of safe savings vehicle or a cash vehicle. So when the crisis happened, people ran to US debt. They ran towards it. People like Peter Schiff were screaming that the house was going to fall down, and everybody's running into the house. So the benefit of being the reserve currency is that you have a lot of sort of extra demand for your assets. You can buy a lot more stuff before you hit your resource limit. So, as Warren Mosler likes to joke, Japan accumulated a lot of American dollars for decades, and it gave America a lot of cars and electronics in return. So would you rather have little green pieces of paper, or would you rather have cars and electronics? Obviously, it can come back on the other side, in the sense that if Japan, as a country started just spending in America, it could buy up a lot of goods or companies. But on one hand, that's just investment. That's what we call investment on any other good day. And we don't really stop unless it's a really big national security disaster. And if it is, we just create a law that says only, X amount of a company can be owned by foreigners. That's not an uncommon thing. Now, I don't, say that we need to do that. I'm not sort of trying to preach some economic nationalism, but I do think that the risk of these entities accumulating a lot of dollars is not that big of a deal. And in the meantime, we get the goods and services. So it's a good deal to be a reserve currency, but it's not necessary as long as you have enough either internally to survive in terms of resources, or you can export so that other countries will buy your stuff and give you the things that you need. Say if you have an insufficient amount of medicine, but you have extra rubber. So you give them rubber and you get medicine or whatever.
Right. Now, you understand one of the reasons why I brought this up like this is because we go from cool and level-headed, where you describe that, hey, we get some benefits being a reserve currency and so forth, to, oh my God, the sky is falling, it's a hyperinflation, what happens when blah, blah, blah. And it becomes an irrational, panicky fear that ends up confusing people based on factors that are either not going to happen or irrelevant or extrapolated out of thin air. And that's why I wanted to address it. Not so much, we're dealing with people here that when they don't have an answer, they create one. And so...
Yeah, so just on that point, so one thing about this to remember is these other countries end up holding this money. So it's not to crash the American economy, because they've basically entangled themselves with the American monetary system. So if you suddenly tanked the American economy, if you were China or Japan, you've just spent all this time accumulating dollars that are now worth nothing.
Yeah.
So it's completely against your own interest to do that. And funnily enough, it's the only thing that's really in your interest is that sweet spot between dumping them and making them worthless and holding on to them forever. So you've got to sort of release them at some reasonable rate anyway, just to keep them worth something. So it's not a big problem. it's just the sort of natural ebbs and flows of international trade and finance. And as I said, it's at the worst, it's the ugly underbelly of international military power. And when it's the underbelly, it's not where that's not where it's happened. You know, that's you're not going to overturn the military, you know, forces that are without their knowledge just by a tweak in the monetary system. That's a deeper fight, you know.
Well, let me ask you another question, because you bring up a great point. As we go through this stuff, I mean, ultimately, people hear certain things, and instead of actually focusing on what the problem is, they literally all of a sudden, we got to get rid of our monetary system. All of a sudden, it's like, oh my God, the dollar, we've got to get rid of our hegemony. Oh my God, we got to get rid of our military. They don't realize, ultimately, at the end of the day, what different pieces of play here. I mean, as you've gone through this and explained it, for a rational person that is not trying to uncover, you know, some boogeyman in the dark shadows, you hear this stuff and you understand. Of course, there are levels of concern at every point. There's nothing that's not a concern. There's always something to be concerned about. But the vast majority of people, they don't listen to this stuff, and they just simply jump from A to oh my God. And it's really hurting our country, I think. The level of misinformation that's out there in the public. So let me ask you a question. We talked a little bit earlier. I had mentioned to you about the need for Americans today to understand what neoliberalism is, because many of the progressives in our community say they want to fight against neoliberalism. Yet when we try to expose how to defeat neoliberalism through an understanding of MMT, they come back and they say that's magic money, or they come back and say something else thoroughly ridiculous that just completely says, I may say I'm against neoliberalism, but I'm actually a staunch supporter of neoliberalism. Can you please explain what neoliberalism is and how MMT can sate that? I mean, give your historical lessons as well, for sure, in this, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So every man and his dog has a definition of neoliberalism. So I won't, you know, profess that I have some objective definition. I think for our purposes, the line that I find that sort of characterizes neoliberalism to me is that line from The Usual Suspects, which is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And so what I think about neoliberalism is that it is an ideology that is unique in the sense that it denies it is an ideology. So it's like when somebody says the only thing that I can't stand is intolerance. You know, the only ideology I can't stand is the one that pretends it isn't an ideology. So the neoliberalist ideology for me is one that tries to propose there is a unique answer to the question of the messiness of politics, right? It's sort of trying to say that we've had left-handers and right-handers fighting forever about which hand is best, and the answer is it's feet. You know, they want to pretend like the problem isn't a real problem. And for me, that is an issue because there really are stories of bad people and good people. There are people that do things that hurt people, and there are people that stop those things from happening. And when you try to sort of say, it's all the same, it's all much of a muchness, it's aren't we all a little bit guilty of everything? You draw this sort of moral equivalence between things that are not the same. And that, to me, is what neoliberalism does to its excellent degree. It says, well, okay, maybe there's fascists, and maybe there's people who believe in free healthcare and childcare and free education. Let's call them socialists. And look, they're both basically the same. One's extreme left and one's extreme right. You know, One wants children who identify with a different gender than that they were assigned at birth to have the right to go to whatever bathroom they want. And the other one wants to burn crosses on black people's lawns. It's the same. It's the same thing. And they kind of have this resigned cynicism towards believing in anything, towards believing that anything can be different than what we have today. This is not just the end of history, this is the end of there being a next step in any conversation worth having. So the challenge becomes trying to get people to believe that there can be big things different tomorrow than there were today. So this, to go to your exact question, Steve, the problem with MMT is MMT pierces the veil that neoliberalism has put on political discourse. So what neoliberalism has said is you can have any policy you want as long as every time you take a little bit, you have to give a little bit. So every time you want to pay Peter, you have to rob Paul. And what this has guaranteed is that there is never a conversation about growth. There is never a conversation about which kind of growth is best or which kind of approach delivers more growth. The only conversation that happens is whose head do we have to stand on to get ourselves a little bit higher? And so that conversation is premised on the idea that we have a scarce amount of stuff. It's a fixed pie mentality, which is why the idea of a government that needs to ultimately pay back all of its debt is so valuable to that story. Because that old line, there's no such thing as a free lunch, means that if the government wants to spend, it has to take it out of your pocket, or if it borrows, it has to take it out of someone else's pocket. So the idea that government borrowing is taking stuff away from other people is fundamental to the neoliberal worldview that nothing is growing. If there was 10 today, there's 10 tomorrow, there'll be 10,000 years from now. The idea that there could be 12 next week is just crazy. That is the thing that the MMT analysis debunks, because it explains that when you issue new treasury debt, you are issuing new net financial assets. You're reducing the supply of money, so to speak, supply of monetary instruments issued by the government from 10 to 12. Then the question is there going to be inflation? And the answer is probably not. If you increase the spending in the economy, just add more money from the government for goods or services, as long as there is spare capacity to produce those goods and services, there's no reason to expect inflation to occur. So what you end up being able to show is that it's not that there was a free lunch necessarily, but that we were didn't know we were wasting. And that's what MMT reveals, is that the biggest so-called free lunch, or the biggest waste, is all of the people we are keeping unemployed by our deliberate decisions. That is a huge amount we are leaving on the table every day of potential economic growth, or at the very least, just preventing economic decline. So one of my law professors used to say, and I like this line, the biggest economic inefficiency in human history is the wastage of human brains.
Okay. Let me ask you something. You know, in the 70s, we kind of pushed away the idea of fiscal space in the, to push all things to the monetarist, the monetary policy. And it has basically turned our country into a financialized economy where regular people are left, constantly spending their money to pay off the interest on a life that has been brought on by austerity, by these ideas of micro austerity. As we keep building these bigger and bigger economies, the money's going completely up here. All the GDP is going to the top, and we've relatively flatlined. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that that's a key point that I'd like to hear you take a shot at.
Yeah. So I'll start with something very technical, and then I'll get very concrete. The very technical thing is the great monetary economist Hyman Minsky, who is sort of one of the intellectual forebearers of MMT, used to talk about the financial instability hypothesis. And it was this idea that over time, an economy that is doing well will get more exuberant and confident about the future and will take on more debt. And over time, will begin to finance more of its day-to-day operation with debt until eventually it's financing its own debt repayments with debt, until it can't roll over its debts and it crashes, and that can bring down a crash in the whole economy. One of the ways that you avoid that from happening is you keep an eye on, at the collective level, the amount of income coming into the private sector relative to the amount of debt it is taking on. So one of the things that happened in the lead up to the '08 crisis that Dean Baker was very aware of was that people's incomes were not rising as much as their debt repayment rates. And so he said, look, you don't need fancy theories about macroeconomics. You can just look at this and say, this is unsustainable. And so one of the things to be very careful about is the overall amount of the leverage of the private sector relative to itself. Now, obviously, when I say relative to itself, it could be households and businesses being indebted to the financial sector. But what it means is it's sort of like saying you have an income of $10,000 a year, but you have a debt of $100,000 a year. You're very indebted relative to your cash flow. And maybe it's working every day, but if you miss one payment, the whole thing comes crumbling down. And so what becomes very important is what's known as the sort of fragility of the financial system, which is a function of the amount of leverage it has relative to its underlying cash flow. Now, as I was just talking about before, one of the big sources of new cash flow is government spending. So if you want to make sure that the economy is growing at a rate where the incomes are good relative to people's debt levels, one way to do that is to keep up government spending levels. Keep up wages, keep up investment programs. Now, when you start to have issues with the overall levels of debt, another thing that you can do is provide public services. And that goes hand in hand with that government spending. So if you want people to take out less student debt, one thing you can do is invest in free college. So one of the first things that happens with neoliberalism is the privatization of public services. So things that used to be free now cost money. Now, one level you can see this with the airlines. You sort of get on the airline, they charge you for the belt buckle and for the peanuts and for the cup of water. Now, in that case, what they're doing is finding every single thing they can squeeze a price out to drop down prices to get more customers. So in that case, there is a flip side to that story, which is by kind of offering bare bones services, they can serve more people who couldn't afford the high level treatment. On the other hand, when you're talking about government services, it's fundamentally a different question. You're not asking how much, we've only got a limited amount of money. How for a limited amount of money, what you ask is, what is the quality of the service we want to provide? And then how much is it going to cost to do that? If you want a good public education for every kid, you just work out what that means and give it to them. And you work out how to, get the resources. So with the issue of debt, one thing is to provide public services. Another thing is to limit is to make sure the amount of public spending is high enough that incomes grow. And then another thing is to keep an eye on financial fraud and financial predation. So things like consumer financial protection, where you prevent these companies from creating credit cards in your name that you didn't know you had, or signing up people with mental illness, or, whatever, charging an overdraft fee that then compounds. And so all of those things can affect the amount of consumer debt, but it's not something that is going to sort of cause a crash on its own. It's something that's going to cause a crash if you don't respond to it properly.
So, Rohan, going back to our friends, the Democrats' favorite son, Bill Clinton, he gets a lot of credit for a surplus, and he gets a lot of credit for a balanced budget and so forth. Is that credit deserved, or is that the beginning? Not the beginning, but is that really the coup de grace of the crash? And what was the effect of Bill Clinton's vaunted surplus and the balanced budget that he supposedly did?
Yeah, so, this is not my story. All credit to people like Stephanie Kelton and Randy Wray, who were telling this a decade ago or more. But the thing to note about this is, as just a basic matter of sort of math and physics, if the government runs a surplus, that means that money no longer exists out there. And by out there, I mean out beyond the walls of the government sector. So if the government runs $1 trillion surplus, that is sucking up $1 trillion from the private sector. It could be the foreign sector. It could be the domestic sector. It could be banks. It could be corporations. It could be households. But it's still taking it out. So the first question is, do we want to be taking money out of the economy? If we need to, fine, but we should know whether we would like to in an ideal world. And I think the obvious question there, the obvious point there is, unless we feel like there is too much money flowing out there, we shouldn't just have some desire to remove some of it. Why would you just wake up one day and decide that you needed to remove something unless you thought it shouldn't be there? So unless we think we need the money, there's no reason for us to take it out, unless we think there's inflation or whatever. When we do think there's something like inflation, the next question is, what's the best way to respond to that? Now, as I said before, you can have inflation with things like a bottleneck from oil. Now, if you had a bottleneck from oil, would it make sense to cut spending across the board? It might not. So it really depends on the situation. Now, in one situation, it might make sense to cut spending. Say, for example, you had a very precious medicine for children with some congenital disease, and it also happened to be a very important ingredient in some rich perfume. Maybe if you taxed that perfume, you would be reducing the amount of people that bought that perfume, and that might be a reason to raise that tax. But you wouldn't be doing it to get the money. You'd be doing it to change people's behavior. So then the question is, because if we need it, maybe we need it. And the answer there, I think, that MMT makes quite clear is, no, we don't. We obviously don't. We have a printing press. Taxing is the same as deleting. You might as well be pressing the delete button on your computer. It's like you go into a Microsoft spreadsheet and you said, oh my gosh, I just wrote $10 million. Whoops, I mean $10. Delete, delete, delete. I just deleted $9 million.
Okay, so I want to ask you a question based on what you just said. So yeah. For the longest time, I have been selling Bernie Sanders' plan, going back. And as you contrasted Hillary and him, Bernie was putting forward $33 trillion in new spending over a decade. I'm assuming Stephanie had her thumb involved in that. And he kept saying, we're going to make Wall Street bail us out. we're going to put a Wall Street speculation tax, all this stuff. And I kept saying, it's just deleted. This is a Pagovian tax. It's a behavior modification tax. It's not a revenue source. When people change their behavior, revenue will shrink, and it will prove, alas, that these programs were never funded by taxes to begin with. So what is your take on some of those things? Are you in a position to speak to the plans that were put out on, from Bernie Sanders?
I mean, I can't speak with any authority from the campaign.
Sure. No. I don't mean, I'm not talking about authority. I'm talking about technical.
Yeah. So I think the logic was exactly what you said. And, Roosevelt had a line when he created Social Security. One of his economists said, FDR, we don't need the taxes. And he said, I guess you're right on the economics. This was politics all the way through. When I put these taxes up, no one can get rid of this Social Security program because people have put their blood and sweat into it. That's what he said. And so, in that case, the taxes give people a sort of moral claim over the benefit. I deserve to retire because I sacrificed when I was a worker. In this case, the idea is I deserve not to have to answer the question of what other things do I want to sacrifice to get this good thing? Because the point is that it should be you who suffers first. So say we got to a point where we were at full resources, right? And say we said, I want to have a whole new spending program on disability. Then, well, where are you going to take that? Are you going to tax some people more? Are you going to cut spending somewhere else? How are you going to free the real resources? If you say tax the rich there, maybe you won't get enough money in dollar terms, but what you're saying is we're going to take it from your standard of living. You're going to have less yachts. You're going to have less trips to the Bahamas. You're going to have a smaller car next year, right? The people who would be making your bigger car are now going to be making the things that we want them to make. That's how we're going to free up the real resources. So on one level, I understand why they're connected. Another level is it's a good way to divert attention. How are you going to pay for it? Let me tell you about how these rich people are too rich. But as I said last time, I think it's a failing strategy. In the long run, it's a strategy where you win a short run and you take 2 steps backwards in the long run. Because in the long run, the problem is the math doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. And so there's 2 problems there. Is 1, you look like a liar when it doesn't add up. And 2, when it doesn't add up, you have stoked the flames of the hysteria that said it was really important that it did add up. So if we can't afford public programs unless we find the money from somewhere, and it turns out the place you promised we'd find the money didn't work, we really can't afford those public programs now. That's how the logic tends to go. The problem is, of course, that unless you've decided to make this your hill to die on politically, it's a big cost to say this. Imagine Bernie Sanders saying, how are you going to pay for it? Tax the rich. Or how are you going to pay for it? Well, we're going to create money, but then we're also going to create this other tax, and it's not going to collect revenue, but it's going to try and discourage behavior. And if it turns out inflation is too high, we're going to raise, it doesn't roll off the tongue the same way.
No, it doesn't.
So unfortunately, if you get to the point where the politician is having to answer this question and the answer isn't already floating in the air around him, it's too late.
Right.
It's people like you who are doing the heavy lifting, trying to bring this conversation to day-to-day people and people who are trying to get this conversation started in the media so that it becomes part of our national fabric. It just becomes one of the stories that we talk about. I obviously, talk to a certain bubble that I live in and work in, but most people have an idea about major names, Snowden or Obama or whatever. If you can get the point where some major idea around money comes up, like the $1 trillion coin, like we talked about last time, where people go, hey, that's funny, and they attach some new idea to, and it sticks in their head, then whole nation's consciousness.
Let me ask you another question, because this is really an important thing. As we try to carve out a progressive movement, as people begin to assess where people are candidate-wise, and they start listening to debates with new ears and new eyes and new understandings of the way economics works, people are starting to realize there's not very many people, if any, either A, telling the truth, or B, knowledgeable. They underestimate, I believe, the power of the activists, the power of the people to raise this truth up so that people like yourself and Stephanie and Scott Fulweiler and the others across the globe who are fighting this out amongst the academia, amongst the policymakers, etc. I think they underestimate how important it is for us to lift the roof up. Because, quite frankly, you nailed it. Politicians are not here to change our mind. Politicians are here to say what we want them to say. And most of us think of our household budget when we think about whether the government is spending beyond its means. And the government has no means because the government is the creator of the dollar. It's God of the dollar. So with that, what would you say to activists is the best way for them to learn this stuff? What are some of the easier things to get them engaged in the learning process? We try to provide links. We try to provide videos, things like that. But have you any special way of explaining this to people that would help them if you just had a 2-minute explainer to get them to the promised land?
I mean, in terms of materials, I'm going to do a plug. I'm the president of the Modern Money Network, and we have a lot of materials and videos and things. So check them out. I think one thing I would emphasize is read things. Say the same thing again. There is a reason that schools and churches force you to recite the same creeds and the same rules over and over. It's because it works pedagogically. It's how these ideas get lodged in your head. I read the same articles or the same arguments dozens of times before they really clicked. And if you stop and think about most things you learn, when you do math equations in primary school, you do it hundreds of times before it gets lodged in your brain. Now, when you go 7 plus 2, you don't count it out. Your brain just clicks it. It's the same thing thinking in things like thinking in balance sheets. If you can close your eyes and see the balance sheet, the T account, and the movements, every time you talk about something, if you could stop in the middle of any description you're giving and write out where the T accounts are, that's when you know you get it. And that was Hyman Minsky who said that, and I highly agree. The other thing I'd say is that when it is persistence with other people, don't be an asshole about it, but be friendly. But persistence works. You will piss some people off, but people will go, "Hey, I didn't get it that first time, but that other time you said it, that other way, it really clicked." And eventually, they can't unsee it. And people say thank you afterwards. They say, thank you. I look at the world differently now after 50 years or 60 years. So I strongly believe in the each one, teach one model. I strongly believe in, being friendly and being calm and not berating people for their ignorance because you didn't know things yesterday that you know today. And to just keep reading, keep, watching the videos, participate in the online discussions. God forbid, read the comments sections.
Oh God, the comments section, some of those are epic with the miser.
Yeah, follow people on Twitter. Follow all the big names on Twitter and look at the people that they read and that they retweet. I think that's one of the best mediums to get new information. And and just keep reading the links, keep reading the materials until it becomes second nature, and try teaching it to people. The best way to learn something is to try and teach it to someone else.
So what is the key? Like, obviously, MMT is not prescriptive, so it's not partisan. MMT is not a progressive movement. It's just a description of the way finance works. However, as you learn how finance works, you learn how our monetary system works, it does tend to point us to a progressive future, in my opinion. But in reality, this is nonpartisan at all. So we should be working on ways to transcend Republicans, to transcend the vote blues who are stuck, and to transcend even the left who is really stuck as well. I mean, there's nobody that's got a lock on this across the board. The only problem is when you have people with an Austrian bend who come in to try to literally troll your page and stuff like that. But when it comes down to it, there's no one that really, I mean, to understand this is like you really are a 1%er. I mean, so what would be the one thing that you would say is the most important takeaway of MMT?
I think to not assume that naturalized constraints are. I think the biggest thing is this sort of taking the speck of dust out of your eye, whether it's the belief that there can't be any growth, whether there's the belief that only the market can determine what is valuable because the market doesn't determine anything. So there's no such thing as value, right? There's no such thing as good and bad. There's no such thing as quality. I think just remembering that every system is something we have constructed and can be constructed with different values if we want to.
Excellent. I love it. So Rohan, we're over time now. I want to thank you so much for joining us again, and I hope that you will come back very, very soon. I absolutely love hearing you talk, man. You're fantastic at this. And, maybe one of the things that our people would benefit from in the future, for those of you who don't know this about Rohan is a world-class debater. This is one of his most talented aspects of presenting this information. Maybe you could come back and give some hints as to how to lay the breadcrumbs and stuff like that. Because it's a very, very critical piece of laying the framework to bring people to a very basic initial understanding. And I think you probably do it fantastic. I mean, you've got the best delivery of them all. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate you having me. Yeah. Happy to come back.
Absolutely. All right, folks, with that, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to end the broadcast. Thank you so much for joining Real Progressives. We will talk to you soon. Have a good day.
Bye.